On the last episode of Right Down the Rabbit Hole, we discussed the effects of colonialism on Puerto Rico and how it's led to a dire financial situation, crumbling infrastructure, and even death. So what can be done about colonialism in Puerto Rico and wherever and however it rears its ugly head? First, we have to know what to look for. Puerto Rico is an obvious example of colonialism, but there are other, more subtle types of colonialism that don't necessarily have to do with nations colonizing another land. The colonialist attitude can have very negative effects around the world in different and surprising ways. On today's episode, we'll discuss the more subtle examples of colonialism, as well as its lasting effects on two places not often associated with colonialism. Join me as we seek more knowledge and a deeper understanding of colonialism in Puerto Rico and beyond. Let's go right down the rabbit hole. Now, Puerto Ricans themselves have differing opinions on the topic of Puerto Rico's future status. The three main political parties on the island are all rooted in their respective beliefs on what the future political status of Puerto Rico should be: statehood, independence, or a continuation of the status quo. Puerto Rico has held 6 different non-binding referendums on their future status, and none have led to any kind of change or movement in their status with the U.S. government. It's like Puerto Rico is in purgatory and they have no control over what happens next. One place that never even had a chance to advocate for its future status was Hawaii. Because it is now a state, people don't often think of Hawaii as an example of colonialism and white supremacy, but the history of Hawaii is different than many may think. Discovered and settled centuries ago, Hawaii had existed as an island chain with differing chiefdoms and kingdoms finally conquered by King Kamehameha in the late 1700s. Around the time his successor, Kamehameha II, inherited the throne in 1819, American missionaries began to settle on the island to proselytize and convert the native peoples and rid them of their traditional ways and practices. By the time the first constitution was enacted in 1840, the erasure was complete and the kingdom was enshrined as a Christian monarchy. By 1887, the white missionaries and settlers had so dominated the culture in Hawaii, by design, that the king was forced to sign a new constitution, which stripped him of much of his power and authority. It established a property qualification for voting, sound familiar? Which further stripped away many native peoples of their right to self-determination, and gave more power to the rich plantation owners and missionaries, mostly white. Now, Hawaii also had a long history of Asian immigration as well. This new constitution also stripped Asian citizens of their right to vote, meaning the majority of the voting populace would not be the native peoples of Hawaii or those whose families had long inhabited the islands, but the white colonialist missionaries who came there to dominate and eliminate the culture and people of Hawaii. And we've seen these very same methods echoed time and time again across the Western Hemisphere. White European settlers using religion to dominate and then eliminate the people and cultures of colonized lands. We saw this in Hawaii with the native Hawaiians and the religious colonization and overthrow of their land. And we saw this in California with the forced assimilation of the native peoples there through missions and forced indoctrinations, even down to the clothes they wore. One place not often thought of, especially by Americans, with regard to colonialism is Canada. But aside from Puerto Rico, some of the most recent horrifying effects of colonialism can be found in our neighbor to the north. Many Americans think of Canada as a place where human rights and gay rights are far more prevalent and ingrained in the culture, and secularism and the common good are the Canadian way. The grass is always greener, right? While these things may be true in theory, it doesn't always end up that way in practice. The most glaring example of this is with residential schools. Residential schools, like the California missions, were meant as places to indoctrinate and civilize the uncivilized native populations of the North. In the late 1800s, a series of laws were passed that sought to deal with the issue of the Indigenous peoples of Canada. In 1894, an amendment to the Indian Act mandated attendance at a school of some type for Indigenous or First Nations children. Due to lack of funding and resources, many First Nations children didn't have access to nearby schools. So residential schools were set up by the Canadian government and run by Christian churches to kill the Indian in the child. Now, these schools were set up oftentimes very far away from the communities that they served, and in doing so, separated these children from the traditions and cultures and families that they were brought up in. Around 150,000 First Nations children were forcibly removed from their homes and indoctrinated in white Christian ways. Now, the United Nations considers the forced removal of a child from their culture to be genocide. Genocide is the act which intends to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, religious, or racial group. Certainly, the residential schools of Canada would fall into this category. Now, you may think that this is horrifying, and it is. Traumatic, it is. And something that happened a long time ago. Sadly, it isn't. The last residential school closed 25 years ago in 1996. The first apology from the Canadian government didn't even come until 2008, 12 years later.
Today, we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country.
The kinds of trauma that the colonialist government of Canada inflicted on First Nations children is real, and it is certainly lasting. And again, in this instance, we see religion used as a tool of colonialism. Now, I am speaking to you as a person who, in my youth, went on 3 missions trips to other countries. The Philippines, a former U.S. colony, Jamaica, a former British colony, and Mexico, a former Spanish colony. So of course I struggle with the impact that I may have had on the people I went across the world to evangelize. Could it have been positive? Sure. But was I perpetuating a centuries-old technique of colonists to go ye into all the world and erase other cultures deemed secular or heathen? It's a tricky question, and I don't have all the answers. But I do know for a fact that missionaries and mission works in the name of God have been used to indoctrinate, brainwash, traumatize, and even kill countless peoples around the world throughout history. So with this aspect of colonialism, mission work, I keep a wary, watchful eye because there is a thin line between spreading faith and erasing culture. So we can see that there are many different types of colonialism and differing effects that it can have, from trauma to erasure to death. But what can be done about it? The first thing we can do is to always look to those who have been colonized to give their own answers and to speak their own truths. For example, an idea often thrown around among well-intentioned people in the United States is statehood for Puerto Rico. After all, they voted for it multiple times, and this would make them equal and give them a voice in voting. But this thinking is flawed, for a few reasons. The main one being that the prior votes for statehood were non-binding, so the electorate was not necessarily made up of a full representation of the Puerto Rican people. We do know that some advocates for independence boycotted previous votes. The only way to truly know the intentions of the people of Puerto Rico is to set up a process that gives them the right to self-determine their future. Thankfully, a law is working its way through the US Congress that would do just that. I strongly urge you to reach out to your congressperson and senators and make sure that they are voting for this law. Another thing we can do is to recognize and make space for those who have been colonized and lift up and amplify their voices. When we truly hear these voices, when we know their stories, we can be better allies and help to prevent colonialism from erasing cultures and communities in the future. One last thing I'd like to impress upon you is to broaden your view of colonialism. It's not just colonists getting on a boat and taking over a faraway land. Colonialism can be as simple as a group of privileged people with means and resources taking over a community, intentionally or unintentionally, and erasing the community until it is no longer recognizable, a process known as gentrification. When we are more intentional about our actions, whether it's the type of neighborhood or housing that we move into, the types of people we vote for, or the types of voices that we listen to or amplify, we can begin to unravel the centuries of colonialist attitudes and actions in small shifts in our attitudes and actions. And those small shifts can lead to big societal changes. Here's hoping. Thanks for joining me on this second deep dive into colonialism. If you like what you see, hit like, subscribe, and share with your friends. See you next time.